So we have some more details from the tell-all book from former White House Press Secretary Stephanie Grisham. So this time she talks about the early response to COVID-19, which we know is a complete mess. So far, COVID has killed nearly 700,000 Americans, and many experts contend that had we had an earlier, very robust response to the pandemic, many of those deaths might not have happened. Fortunately for us, that early response was led by none other than Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, two people who have no idea what they're doing, never had any idea what they're doing, and yet somehow, for some reason, we're put in these very important positions. Weird. So now Grisham described these two as know-it-alls. Interesting. So now here's what she wrote. When I worked for the First Lady in the East Wing, we had all come to call Jared and Ivanka the interns, which of course is very insulting to interns. Because they represented in our minds obnoxious, entitled know-it-alls. Again, think of the poor interns, okay? Interns are not that bad. So I'm just gonna say that. I'm gonna defend the honor of interns everywhere and say that Ivanka and Jared, far, far worse than any intern ever. Just say that, okay? Just gonna say that. So now, Mrs. Trump had found that nickname amusing and occasionally used it herself. So now, great, okay, so that the interns, and they go and they, they're know-it-alls, like, oh, I know this, I know that, I can do this job, I can do that. Okay, what happened to peace in the Middle East? Did we ever get peace in the Middle East? No? Of course not. So now, unfortunately, and again, I talked about this before, early on in the Trump administration, before COVID happened, I said, just imagine the dysfunction that we already know, that's already been publicized. Imagine what would happen if we ever had a real crisis. And it turns out we had a real crisis. And now Grisham goes on to explain how they dealt with the crisis. In fact, Grisham describes how, as COVID-19 began to spread across the globe in late February 2020, Kushner had pushed Trump to travel during a pandemic to India. Even though the president actually didn't want to because the president's lazy. And I mean Trump, right? Kushner also ended up negotiating directly with the Indian government about what the White House security assets on the ground would be. Once again, it's a duty that is normally reserved for the Secret Service. But no, Kushner's got to jump right in. Kushner's like, no. I'm going to do this because I'm important. I'm important. Now, Grisham writes that this was just another example of Jared sticking his nose into things that were not his expertise. Again, it didn't really have an expertise other than, I guess, running a slum, a building that screws over tenants, people that live there. I mean, that if that's a skill, I mean, that's what he's good at. That's where he makes his money, off the Kushnervilles. Not so much with COVID and peace in the Middle East. Now, she said it felt completely irresponsible and against protocol, which is the epitome of Jared Kushner in the Trump White House. Honestly, I'm not exactly sure what she expected from this. I mean, elect a clown, get a circus. And by the way, Stephanie Grisham, for a long time, was part of that circus. And I got to keep pointing that out because now she's like, oh man, how terrible, blah, blah, blah. But you were in it. You were part of this. And you didn't leave until the very, very end. When something bothered you so much, the January 6th Capitol insurrection, that's when you got out. But nowhere else. So when the writing was on the wall, that's when Stephanie Grisham said, all right, that's it, I'm out. Gone. I'm done. So it's cowardice on her part. Nonetheless, I do enjoy that she is spilling the tea. And so I'm going to continue to read these excerpts and not actually buy her book. Please don't buy her book. All right. So that said, she further explains that in early March, after the WHO declared that COVID-19 was a pandemic, Ivanka and Jared insisted on, during a meeting in the Oval Office, that Trump deliver a televised address to the nation. Now, the problem is, of course, with everything in the Trump White House, there was no plan, there was no strategy. And nobody knew what the hell they were doing. The result, of course, was the president going in front of the country and saying basically nothing. And I'm going to show you that address here in a minute, or at least some of it. But Grisham went on to describe those discussions. Quote, in the middle of all that, Ivanka kept chiming in, but I think there should probably be an address to the nation tonight. Finally, Ivanka turned to her most powerful ally besides her father. Jared, don't you agree? Any guesses as to what Jared replied? None, of course. At one point, he said, I called Ivanka out on her plan with what seemed to be an obvious question. What is it we'd be saying? Because if she had a message she wanted her father to deliver, it was still a mystery to me. She just looked at me, seemingly confused. Well, of course she didn't have any idea. But understand that none of that matters, right? None of it matters at all. The number one rule in the Trump family is to get in front of the camera as soon as you can. No matter what, never waste a crisis, right? Doesn't matter if you have a plan. Doesn't matter if you have anything to say. Just make something up in the spot. So, also you can get in front of it and get good ratings. Understand that these people chase the media. And in return, of course, the media chases them. And it's kind of a vicious cycle. Unfortunately, I am also feeding into that cycle by covering these stories. And I'm completely aware of that little, of that little issue. Let's just say they're that good at, chasing that camera. But anyway, so that said, it works really good, that strategy, in celebrity circles, which is essentially what they are. And even in some cases when it comes to politics, chasing that camera and getting out and getting ahead and becoming a media spectacle can be pretty good. However, where it fails is when you have to deal with policy, when you have to deal with something that is actually pretty serious and requires a consistent, strong message. Because what you need to do as president during a crisis is to have a plan to reassure the population that you're taking proactive steps, that you're doing the right thing, and that even before you deliver that message, you've already started setting that up. Unfortunately, none of that happened. So now Trump did direct the group, which included Vice President Mike Pence, Dr. Anthony Fauci, to go into the cabinet room and to, quote, figure out what to do outside the commander-in-chief's presence. So he didn't even go in the room. Well, of course. Why would he go in the room? You think he cares about details? No. You think he cares about the nitty-gritty of what's going on, of the policy and what we should do? Oh, no, of course not. That's for nerds. Hey, Poindexter, go figure this out for me while I go sit here and eat hamburgers and watch cable news. And tweet, by the way, because he still had a Twitter account back then. Now, what happened in that room, of course, is, once again, disaster. She describes this, quote, what struck me in that cabinet room meeting was that Jared, who was sitting next to the Vice President of the United States, commandeered the meeting and was calling all the shots. As many times as I'd seen him behave that way with members of our senior staff, that particular time made me uneasy because it was with the Vice President. It was disrespectful, and I remember feeling both embarrassed and disgusted. Once again, not as embarrassed and disgusted enough to quit. Just saying. But it gets worse. So now Jared was running the show. While that was happening, Ivanka was also in the meeting doing what she does best, saying, Daddy, my daddy says. Grisham adds, and I'm serious, Ivanka was also doing her my father wants this and my father thinks that routine, making it impossible for staff members to argue a contrary view. Now, my question, of course, is if Donald Trump wanted it so bad, why wasn't he in the meeting? It's because it's not what Donald Trump wanted, what Ivanka Trump wanted. And look, Ivanka Trump wants money and clout, and to be, honestly, she wants to be taken seriously. That's why she kept going up to the people at the G20 meeting and getting rejected, like, okay, yep, we see you, little girl, okay, but you don't have anything to add to this to the conversation because you're dumb. Go sit back down. And that's what was going on here. She does not know what she's talking about. She's not an expert. She's a fail daughter. And that's it. Why is her input important at all? So, of course, she has to say, Daddy, but my daddy said. No, if you want to be taken as a serious person, then why don't you work on being a serious person? Get some education, learn some things, come back. Now, Grisham said the entire situation left her feeling both helpless and demoralized and outraged at Kushner's behavior. She said he was not an expert on any of those things, shutting down borders, the economic consequences, the health consequences, yet he alone seemed to be deciding the nation's first actions to address one of the most devastating crises in our history. Kushner, of course, also ultimately wrote Donald Trump's speech, but left no time for fact-checking, as if they would ever do that anyway, or vetting, once again, never do that, or even enough time for Trump to read it. He never reads it anyway. He's a one-pager kind of guy. That's it. And so Donald Trump will read anything off the prompter. In fact, here he is reading stuff off the prompter.
Today, the World Health Organization officially announced that this is a global pandemic. We have been in frequent contact with our allies, and we are marshaling the full power of the federal government and the private sector to protect the American people. This is the most aggressive and comprehensive effort to confront a foreign virus in modern history. I am confident that by counting and continuing to take these tough measures, we will significantly reduce the threat to our citizens, and we will ultimately and expeditiously defeat this virus. After consulting with our top government health professionals, I have decided to take several strong but necessary actions to protect the health and well-being of all Americans. To keep new cases from entering our shores, we will be suspending all travel from Europe to the United States for the next 30 days. The new rules will go into effect Friday at midnight. These restrictions will be adjusted subject to conditions on the ground. There will be exemptions for Americans who have undergone appropriate screenings, and these prohibitions will not only apply to the tremendous amount of trade and cargo, but various other things as we get approval. Anything coming from Europe to the United States is what we are discussing. These restrictions will also not apply to the United Kingdom.
Please clap.
Jeb energy right there. Definitely not normal Donald Trump, but reading off the prompter very poorly Donald Trump. So, again, here's what Grisham had to say about that, by the way. It was a total clusterfuck from start to finish because Ivanka and her crew wanted her father to be on TV. And of course, noted that the speech contained a number of misstatements and sloppy wording, some caused by the president stumbling over a few phrases that sowed confusion about such things as which countries would be affected by the new travel restrictions and if international trade would be banned. After the speech, the White House was flooded with calls from federal agencies seeking clarification about the speech, and a line of reporters formed outside of Grisham's office. So, whoops, that's what happens when Princess gets her way. Oh, I'm sorry, one of the interns. So now what happened after that speech, which, again, Donald Trump was not happy about? Well, nothing happened to Ivanka. Nothing happened to Jared. Nothing happened to anybody except for the communications team. In fact, here's what she wrote. Of course it was our problem, not Jared or Ivanka or Hope Hicks, who was still in the White House at the time. No, they were in the dining room of the Oval Office. Off of the Oval Office, Trump's usual hangout, congratulating themselves and telling the president how awesome he was. Oh, yes, why don't we just give ourselves a pat in the back for this very disastrous speech? No, The real problem was the communications team. We did great. They're the ones that messed up. Gee, yeah, can you see why Stephanie Grisham might have a little bit of a bone to pick with Jared and Ivanka? I have noticed that some of the best juicy stuff in this book, in the excerpts that have been released, have been about Jared and Ivanka. Oh, she despises them. And this is a good, window into why. Because she'd always get the shit where Jared and Ivanka would be treated like would-be royalty. Because that's what they believed themselves to be. So now, again, this is what happens, unfortunately, when non-serious people are handed serious power. Again, elect a clown, get a circus. And it goes, by the way beyond just the politics. Understand that this is the effects of this entire chaos in the White House was deadly and disastrous for the country. Remember, you had all this economic hardship as a result of COVID, all the death, and all of that is the fault of Trump, Kushner, and Ivanka, Stephen Miller, and many of the others. So now one more note here about Kushner himself from Grisham. She says, I had shared with Mrs. Trump many times my opinion that if we lost re-election in 2020, it would be because of Jared. It was my fervent opinion that his arrogance and presumption had grown over the years, and he threw his power about with absolutely no shame. I would venture to say that being in the White House changed Jared as a person. There was no reason that he should be sitting with the speechwriter laying out our nation's plan to fight a global pandemic, and I knew that if things went badly with the speech, felt inevitable, he would be the first person to say in the president's ear that it was the comms team that had fucked it all up. He was Rasputin in a slim-fitting suit. Other nicknames I have heard, of course, is the Slim Reaper, or what some of you have suggested, Slenderman. But here's the thing, though. I don't think Jared changed at all. I think this is an example of what power does to people. It exposes who they actually are, or who they have always been, in this case. So if you're a terrible person with no power, well, you're still a terrible person. Now, if you're a terrible person with no power, but have aspirations to do so and access, say you were born with lots and lots of money, well then, you're going to do what you have to do. You're going to kiss the asses that you have to kiss in order to get ahead. And then when you do get that power, all the pretense disappears and you reveal how horrible you've always been. You get to throw your weight and your power around. And that's what Jared Kushner did. That's it. Again, he was an advisor. He knew nothing about the job that he was going to fill, and yet tried to fill all the jobs. And the disaster of the country, I mean, we see the result of this. We see the result. And again, I think Stephen Miller and Jared Kushner were more president than Donald Trump was. Call it a shadow presidency, if you will. Donald Trump, of course, is the face and the mouth. He held the pen, said the words. Miller and Kushner wrote those words, wrote the speeches, crafted some of the policies, all of it, of course, based on what Donald Trump actually said he wanted. But what Donald Trump wanted was just based on what his fans wanted. It was a reflection of the Republican base and what they wanted. So he said the things and did the things that they wanted him to do in order to get money, to be, in power, to get more money and political power, as I said. And that's why, of course, this was a mess. Nobody knew at all what they were doing, especially the president. And now, nearly 700,000 Americans later, millions more have lost homes, jobs, etc. as a result of all this. It's just another example of why we can't let incompetence back into the government again or ever, because it ends up being an absolute disaster. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and share with your friends. You can subscribe and help out the channel by becoming a patron. It's patreon.com/Jeff Waldorf, or you can become a channel member as well by hitting the join button below.